Welcome to PseudoPod, the weekly horror podcast. What follows is horror fiction read in tooth and claw, and not for the faint-hearted. Consider yourself warned.
From the team behind the award-winning Best Fiction Horror podcast, Nightlight. A new audio drama that brings the southern folklore of True Blood and the cosmic horror of Lovecraft Country to your ears.
You don't hear that, do you?
Afflicted is a tale of hoodoo, a demonic book bound in human flesh, and natural disasters that are anything but natural.
Which grave did you get the dirt from? Which grave?
Afflicted, a horror thriller audio drama coming Halloween 2022, but only if we raise enough money to pay everyone a living wage. Support Afflicted at bit.ly/supportafflicted to hear the full series this fall.
It's happening.
PseudoPod, episode 815, June 17th, 2022. This week's story, Stink Pit, by Liam Hogan. Hello everyone, welcome to PseudoPod, the weekly horror podcast. I'm Alistair, your host, and this week's story comes to us from Liam Hogan. Liam is an award-winning short story writer with stories in Best of British Science Fiction and in Best of British Fantasy from Yukon Press. He's been published by Analog, Daily Science Fiction, and Cast of Wonders. I know those guys. He helps host Liars League London, volunteers at the creative writing charity Ministry of Stories, and lives and avoids work in London. You can find more details at his website, which you can, of course, find linked in the show notes. Your reader for this week is the magnificent Ant Bacon. Ant is based in Manchester in the UK with his husband Neil. Oh, congrats, buddy. He is a screen and voice performer, as well as a digital content creator, editor, and very occasional writer. In short, he is a control freak who wants to do all the creative jobs. When he isn't cursing at editing software, he can be found walking his miniature schnauzer Hugo or immersing himself in obscure indie horror films. So, before we go any further, a warning that what this story's title suggests is much like this story. Absolutely true. So if gore is not your thing, maybe skip this one. If gore is your thing, well, the truth is, just follow your nose.
Stink Pit by Liam Hogan. Read by Ant Bacon. John Arnold's traps were full. Too many rabbits for one man's needs. He could try selling a few down the lamb for a fiver or maybe just a pint, though if he did, he'd have to suffer the taunts of gamekeeper turned poacher. It wasn't accurate. It had been his dad, Bob Arnold, who had been the gamekeeper for the estate that was now lorded over by a know-nothing Yank. Technically, J.A. wasn't poaching either, because J.A. was a landowner himself. Only the gamekeeper's cottage and its postage stamp kitchen garden, passed down from father to son, having been unexpectedly bequeathed in the previous estate owner's will. Unexpected, because who knew Old Man Farrington had a heart, let alone a soft spot for a long-serving employee? The local wag said Bob must have known where the bodies were buried, the old man's second wife in particular. But she'd been 30 years her husband's junior, so maybe she'd grown tired of waiting for him to die, something he always seemed on the cusp of doing, some ghastly wasting disease with an impossible-to-remember name. Little wonder the old man had become obsessed with the occult, or, so the rumours said, when more practical remedies eluded him. J.A. stroked the cool grey fur of the 5 limp, unresisting bodies as he contemplated the tiny but startling difference between sleep and death. He dimly remembered Mrs. Farrington, the second wife, from when he was a lad. Crazy to think she must have been the same age he was now. She'd worn those years much better than he did. Her impossibly long black hair, glimpsed from afar, had seemed like a sleek garment, a silky shawl. Maybe it was J.A.'s bachelor perspective that painted her face, framed by those funeral curtains, as tragically unhappy. She should have been more patient. she'd missed her payout by less than 4 years, even if it was 4 years of terminal decay to both the old man and his estate. For a while after her disappearance, he'd been rejuvenated, dispensing with the wheelchair for one last Indian summer swan song. But time had caught up with him in the end, pagan rituals or no. His own father had followed the old man to the grave barely 3 months later. A heart attack, out here alone in the woods, his body found cold and lifeless, a decade from drawing a state pension. Hands like claws, and a face contorted in pain, in fear by all accounts. The sparsely attended funeral was the same week J.A. finished the university degree he'd never found any use for. The same week the manor house changed hands, sold to cover inheritance tax and other accumulated debts. J.A. took up the gamekeeper's cottage just in time to be rendered redundant by the new owner, who quickly proved he knew jack shit about the acres of land he'd bought. The florid Yank preferred a more comfortable remove between what was on his dinner plate and where it had come from. Headless fish and plucked and gutted fowl, shrink-wrapped and ready-seasoned, oven temperatures and cooking times in easy-to-read print. As far as J.A.'s own dinner plans and limited budget were concerned, the gamekeeper's cottage had come with perpetual hunting rights on the entire, slowly shrinking Farrington estate. So J.A. was no poacher, and his rabbits were fair game, even if more plentiful than he needed. Another echo from the past crept up on him as he hovered over his hall. His dad had been showing him a cunning way of culling far more foxes than the horse and the hounds of the disbanded village pack could ever cope with. And it all started with death. Death calls to death, his dad claimed. And that was the beauty of the stink pit. The bigger and ranker it grew, the more irresistible to foxes it became. He'd not seen or heard of it done in, 20 years? Never done himself, of course, but the method seemed simple enough, if barbaric. He lifted a plump brace of rabbits over the shoulder of his ancient barber and dragged the other 3 along the grass. The perfect bait for the perfect spot. A small depression, ringed by blackthorn hedges and off the beaten track, away from hikers and dog walkers. The same spot his dad had used. J.A., a lanky teenager with a head full of the future, had been bored and infuriated by his dad's insistence that he watch, that he learned, as if it was some vitally important skill, as though his dad already knew there wouldn't be a chance for a repeat lesson, ignoring the uncomfortable fact that his son didn't much care one way or the other. He could still picture the scene, the exact location of the pit, still remember the cloying, pungent, sickly sweet smell that lingered in his memory long after, if not in reality. He definitely recalled his dad telling him something about using 5 snares. J.A. chewed his lip. Perhaps he should have paid more attention after all, because he couldn't remember if it was warned to always use 5 snares or to never use 5 snares. 5 or 6, what did it matter? Even at the time, J.A. had been aware that his dad was behaving oddly, on edge, his temper brittle, jumping at the slightest noise, sitting up late into the night, a tumbler of rough scotch in one hand, and a shotgun, thankfully broken open but otherwise ready for use, across his blanketed knees. Early onset dementia was J.A.'s retrospective diagnosis. The heart attack was probably a blessing. There had even been a heated argument with the old man, a few months later, about the time the wheelchair reappeared, and shortly before J.A. headed to university, over something his dad had refused to do, not again. The details, but not the fury on both sides, had been masked by distance, as J.A. leant against a fence post at a polite remove, feigning boredom, but feeling nauseous. He'd never seen his dad angry with anyone else before, and had wondered how it might end. It ended the usual way, which seemed horribly unjust. The sins of the father were visited upon the children, most often by the father. J.A. had sworn it was the last beating. that he would stand up for himself in the future. After all, was he not fitter and taller than his dad? Was he not an adult now, his father's equal, if not his better? And then he'd done everything he could to avoid testing his father's fragile resolve, not coming home between terms, not even for a weekend visit, claiming he needed to earn money, the only excuse his dad would respect. After 3 years away, he'd almost forgotten the smell of his father's tweed, the moment of stillness before he erupted, the curl of his lip when J.A. tried to explain what he was going to university to learn. Almost. But the empty armchair, the too quiet cottage, hadn't allowed him to. Funny how he'd let himself be dragged back by just the opportunity to live rent-free. Funny how the only person he could have sold the Gamekeeper's cottage to was the Yank whose land surrounded and imprisoned it. Funny how he'd slipped into the man-sized hole his father had left behind. J.A. shook his head. What had gotten into him? He hadn't thought of any of this for years. All he needed to remember was how his dad had laid out the stink pit, the snares lying in wait for inquisitive foxes. He surveyed the spot, trying to figure out where they would have to approach from. The wickedly thorned bushes made that easy, made sense of the chosen location. 5 snares, evenly spaced around the perimeter of the shallow depression, would fit just fine. 5? Oh, what the hell? Suspicious nonsense, whatever it was, like never neglecting to greet the magpies. His load lightened to just the 2 rabbits. He headed back to the cottage via the orchard. The Yank's apples came encased in plastic, in units of 6, dosed in pesticides from Waitrose. Such an awful goddamn waste of God's own bounty. To see the fruit lying there, rotting away, wasps, slugs and birds the only beneficiaries. J.A. took a windfall. Just the one, eaten as he walked. He could have picked bagfuls straight from the trees and no one would have batted an eyelid. Probably. But the right to hunt didn't include scrumping apples, did it? At the back of his mind, J.A. had always been wary of his inherited status. It might have been legal, but was it cast iron? If the Yank ever decided to throw enough money at pet lawyers, if J.A. had ever given him the cause to, any transgression would surely have come back to haunt him. The Yank, when he realised that on all his vast estate there was only one parcel he didn't own, even if it was barely a 20th of an acre, had thrown a casual but generous offer on the table. Enough to swap the cottage for an identikit new build the developers were throwing up all around the fringes of a hived-off estate, or for J.A. to set sail for pastures new and never return. But he'd still been in mourning, still uncertain of what to do with his life, and still stubbornly contemptuous of the smiling Yank and his easy money. The odd, informal setup quickly became a talking point. The Yank would stand on his veranda with his dinner guests, look down across the wide sweep of his land and say, "All you see is mine. Except that bit. That bit belongs to John Arnold, and the daft bugger won't sell." 2 decades later, J.A. was still chained to the cottage and to the estate, even though he wasn't paid for anything other than the casual work he did elsewhere, and even though the estate was now bordered in 3 directions by soulless housing developments, eating away at his hunting grounds. The old village pub had also held out against the tide of modernity, deliberately neglected for fear of being overrun by newcomers who had popped their heads into the gloom, dream wistfully of a bright countryside gastropub, and never return. No pub lunches for J.A. From the unfished trout pools to the plentiful rabbit and hare and partridge, he could dine like a king any day of the week. A king without a queen. It turned out no one wanted to share his cottage, or his hermit-like lifestyle, or the temper he'd inherited from his dad, the one that only ever came out in private, which was a shame because there was always far more than he could eat alone, And technically his licence to hunt didn't allow him to sell the surplus game he caught. Or so some armchair lawyer down the Lamb had claimed. Maybe the easy jibe of the regulars wasn't so far off the mark after all. Or maybe it was just bitterness. Because the one thing J.A. still did for the estate, for his own benefit, was to fend off any actual poachers, rare though they were these days. He did his nighttime patrols with his father's shotgun as often as not, and word got around. And if he found snares that weren't his, he destroyed them. It made him no friends. Nor with the stink pit. There was no real reason to do it, no burning need to cull foxes. The Yank wasn't interested in breeding pheasants, or rabbits for that matter. He was probably more happy to spot a wily fox waltzing boldly across his land, a ball of feathers stuffed in its grinning mouth. Well, fuck him and his money. And fuck the small-minded people in the pub. The ones who claimed J.A. was a fake and that he wasn't half the man his father was, that he didn't deserve his nice little cottage or his hunting rights, that he was no custodian of the land. They said he was mere unskilled labour, no better than a seasonal migrant who didn't even know English. A dig at J.A.'s university education. What the fuck had he been thinking? 3 years doing English literature. Little wonder that he barely scraped a degree. Not that J.A. was stupid, or that a third was all he was capable of, but because the effort of doing any better was more than such an up-its-own-arse subject was worth. He'd seen straight eventually. It was 20 years since he'd last picked up a book. But he knew this land as well as his father, even if he didn't have the fancy job title. And it was time to prove what he'd learned, time to see what stumbled into his new laid trap. The first day was a disappointment. The trio of rabbit bodies went undisturbed, the 5 snares lay empty. But it hardly lived up to its name yet, did it? Stink pit. There weren't even many flies buzzing around the rabbit's sightless eyes. He wondered if this was such a good spot after all. The quiet lay heavy and ominous, as though other animals were avoiding it, as if aware of the slaughter he had planned. J.A. shrugged the feeling off. You had to be patient with snares and traps. On Wednesday, there was a single scraggly fox as reward, already dead, neck caught in the wire loop. When his dad ran his stink pit, the tails of the foxes were the only bit he removed, before adding the bodies of the foxes to the pit. It turned J.A.'s stomach. Not the death so much, not even the offensive smell, but the sense of waste, the sad trophies. Those brushes, hanging in the outhouse for nearly 3 months, uncommented on when the local constabulary searched every corner of the estate for the missing wife, had been turned in at the start of the grouse season, a bounty paid on each of them. That the owners of those tails had already been dead for 12 weeks didn't apparently matter. He unclipped his pocket knife and set to. It was surprisingly tough work. The dead fox didn't seem to want to part with its tail, and carrying it back to the cottage, J.A. felt a little repulsed by the tattered thing. Hardly the luxurious brushes he remembered his father collecting. By the end of the week, it had been joined by 2 more. A spell of fine autumnal weather had brought back summer temperatures. The toll mounted, and the smell from the stink pit ripened, stirring distant memories, before edging over into something that had him panting through his mouth. Short, shallow breaths that left him dizzy and wet-eyed, a sledgehammer reek that doubled him up and made him postpone his breakfast until after the morning's task was done. There was a new brush to be cut and hung almost every day. Friday arrived, and J.A. was nursing a pint in the close confines of the Lamb, not sure why he bothered. They never cleaned the pipes. His beer was tainted by a whiff of sour decay. He was startled to be approached by a man he half recognised. Most times, people left him alone, or heckled him from afar. Most times, he only came to the Lamb to look for casual work when funds ran low, or the cottage needed a bigger repair than he could manage or scrounge materials for. The man held 2 pints, one in each hand, which rendered him at least relatively harmless, big though he was. "You the one behind the stink pit?" "Yes," J.A. said, feeling himself tense. The man nodded and put down one of the pints. "My thanks." "Chicken farmer, are you?" "If you want any of the brushes, you let me know," J.A. called to the retreating back as the man rejoined his mates. He eyed the still settling pint with faint nausea. Should have eaten before he came out. Still, a pint unasked for was a rare thing. A thank you, even rarer. Most of all, though, he felt annoyance. He'd have to close the stink pit now. It shouldn't be that much of a surprise it had been discovered, even less that it had been tracked back to him. But word would spread, and before very long at all, some animal lover would kick up an almighty fuss, and the local paper might even splash a picture, and sure as eggs is eggs, he'd cop the heat. He almost wished he had the balls to brazen it out, as no doubt his dad would have done, hiding behind the old man's authority. But J.A. suspected the Yank would be none too pleased when a stink pit was discovered on his land. Tomorrow. He'd fill it in tomorrow. It'd be a job and a half, and a fragrant one at that. He couldn't quite remember how long ago he'd caught those rabbits, but there were 11 fox brushes hanging in the shed, 11 copper-haired carcasses rotting in the pit. And that wasn't all. Someone else had been adding dead animals to the pile. Maybe the chicken farmer, damn him. There were roadkill pheasants and the odd squirrel mixed into the bloated, decaying mess. There was even a cat in there. The mangled body devoid of any identifying collar that J.A. could see from the perimeter, and that was as close as he was willing to get. Ignorance was bliss, for both him and the pet owner. At least he'd not have to deliver the bad news or explain where the ragged moggy had been found. By now, the pit was, if not full, then at least a layer of dead animals thick. Those in the centre, a putrefying, rotten mass. Those nearer the edge, still looking like they might stir whenever he approached. Brambles and nettles grew thick around the hollow, as if revelling in the bloodshed, and even the grass had been buried at its sick heart, so that you couldn't tell how deep the pit of death was. Never mind the cat, he could have hidden anything beneath that layer. Who would be brave enough to wade in and dig it out? He slept uneasy, hungover dreams haunted by pets that yowled at his door, turning with their decayed, half-exposed skulls and absent eyes to follow him whenever he tried to escape. Skipping breakfast, he belatedly remembered he'd skipped dinner the evening before as well, staggering home after last orders. Hollow-bellied and with a dull ache between his eyes, he headed out as the sun broke through the morning mist, carrying a shovel and a bottle of water. It was going to be another warm day. Best get it done before the sun reached full strength. He caught the smell of the pit while he was still some way off, the reek intensifying with every step. He realised he'd been carrying it around with him the past few days, the corruption clinging to his clothes. Ending this was overdue. On the wooded fringes, something blotted out the sun, and J.A. flinched as, with a sharp handclap, black wings soared above. A magpie or a crow or maybe a raven. He hoped the scavenger had had its fill, because shortly the pit would only be food for worms. He tapped the knife at his belt, grimacing as his stomach gave another spasm. Despite it all, he fancied bagging a 12th brush. 12 would elevate the haul to something of legend status. 12? Or was it 13 had been his father's tally? 12 would make J.A. his equal at least as far as stink pits were concerned. He grinned as he came upon the first snare, despite the sourness of his stomach. The 12th brush greeted him like a white-tipped arrow. And then, as he lifted his head to view the rest of the scene, he could hardly believe it. The same, to the left and right of him, twice more across the far side. 5 foxes, 1 per snare, all facing the heart of the pit, as if they'd converged from different directions. Probably they had. Who knew the Yanks' estate held so many vermin? Or Was the vile smell of the stink pit pulling them in from miles around? He was shaking his disbelieving head, hand on hips, when something moved. Something in the pit, among the dead animals. A dog? A cat? Or another fox, saved from the plight of his companions because the snares were already full, too busy feeding to pay heed to J.A.? No. Whatever it was too smooth, too long. It was an arm. Christ, a human arm! Some damn fool had blundered into the middle of the stink pit and come a cropper. Overwhelmed by the evil miasma, fainting away. An idiot local reporter or photographer trying to get the best shot and twisting an ankle in sudden panic. Without pausing, J.A. plunged past the lifeless attendant foxes and into the pit, his heavy boots crunching through rotted corpses, a cloud of flies bursting forth on a wave of fetid odour that momentarily threw him back, his hand raised to protect his face. It was a woman's arm. He could see that now as it fluttered above the blood and guts, thankfully alive, but struggling. Too slender to be a man, even a young one. Toned, not like the arm of a woman in the first flush of youth, the easy curves of those who had never had to do much with them. Someone more mature, though not yet old. Someone around J.A.'s age. Leaning forward, stance unsteady, his feet sunk almost to his knees. He seized the hand as it flapped, opening and closing in the buzzing air. It was cold and slippery, but he gripped firmly and pulled. A second wall of fat flies, denser than the first, filled his mouth and nose and eyes. He coughed and spluttered them away as the bedraggled animal bodies shifted beneath him. White, squirming maggots were pushed into the light, wriggling with impotent fury. The more he pulled, the more the arm was exposed, then a bare, bony shoulder. What the hell was anybody doing buried like that? And why were they not wearing any clothes? From the edges of the pit, from the 5 points of a jagged star, a crude pentagram, the soulless eyes of the dead foxes watched and disdained to answer his unspoken questions. He continued to heave, the woman's hand tightly gripping his, the slender neck coming up, and then finally the head, hidden by a curtain of long, black hair, tangled and smeared with blood and viscera, hanging at an uncomfortable, impossible angle, as though there was no strength left to hold it upright, on the brink of total exhaustion. The woman's other arm, wrapped around his shoulder, limply at first, and then, as her back was exposed, she clung to him like an awkward dancer, throwing him off balance. He tried to take a step, but he couldn't shift his feet, sunken in the mire, any more than he could free hers. It was like they were both stuck in quicksand, and slowly, horribly, J.A. realized that with every pull, every strain of his muscles, he was sinking further. Her head lolled upright, and he was staring into the ichor-smeared face of the missing second wife of his father's long-dead employer. Her eyes fluttered open and flashed white amid the gore, and she wrapped skeletal limbs around him in a tight embrace. He opened his mouth to yell, just as she locked her thin lips on his and sucked down a charnel stench fouler than anything he had suffered so far. John Arnold's gagging scream caught in his throat, swallowed greedily by the woman, swallowed by the grave, reverberating in his skull for all eternity, as the putrid carcasses closed rank above their heads, and he was dragged even deeper beneath the fathomless stink pit.
This is a note from Liam. Stink pits are, regrettably, a real thing, and every so often someone stumbles across one, and there's a newspaper article and a campaign to ban them. As a Londoner whose tiny garden is frequently visited by a city fox, the idea is so abhorrent that a horror story was always going to be born from it. There is a line in this story, this is Alistair again, by the way, that haunts me, chills me, I would argue more than the biological horror. It was this. He'd seen straight eventually. It was 20 years since he'd last picked up a book. There is such tragedy encoded into that line. Tragedy that speaks to the limitations society forces on us all, and those limitations, those walls, are never more apparent than in small communities. To make the obvious joke, the difference between a stink pit and a small town is one of them is a closed-off area defined by decades of accreted history, usually bad, often angry, and crammed full of people who do anything not to be there, and the other is a stink pit. But the thing I love about this story is how it moves past the obvious, and how it's all encoded into that line. The protagonist here has made the best of things, and believe me, I hate that phrase almost as much as I hate keep calm and carry on. And you know what? So does he. He hates it. He hates it in that unique way where all you can do is stand there and hate it until either you break or the loop does. And sometimes the loop gets tired of waiting. And then all you have is ignorance and stench and horror and the hint of something awful you aren't even nearly equipped to understand or feel you don't deserve to. Suppressed feelings embedded in rancid flesh. Corpses as building blocks for something unspeakable. The decay of the soul mirrored by the decay of the body. Eventually, this one has teeth. Excellent work all around. We have 5 shows now. EscapePod, PseudoPod, Podcastle, Cast of Wonders, and Catscast. I am rocking up on 15 years in this chair, which is frankly ridiculous, and I'm honoured and humbled to work with such an amazing team, such amazing authors, and an audience that literally powers us. Because you do. We rely on you to pay our authors and cover our server costs and every other cost, frankly. We're now at the point where we're paying everyone, and that's a major benchmark because we believe everyone who works in this field deserves to be rewarded for their time. Without any element of our staff, from editors to authors to hosts to producers to slush readers and associate editors, the whole system collapses. Everyone is needed. Everyone deserves to be paid. And in the grips of what no one is calling a recession, we could use some help. So, if you can help out, please do. You can donate any amount you want, or subs start from $5 a month through PayPal and Patreon. That gets you access to the support bonus content, including PseudoPod Extrusions, which is a whole other raft of stories, and extra episodes of Catscast. It's a great deal. You get things, we get things, we make more things for you because you've paid to get those things. So, if you can, please help out. Thank you. Join us next week for episode 816, The Gamekeeper's Harvest by Toby Ogunduran. The Gamekeeper's Harvest is going to be narrated by Opie Ogunduran, produced by Chelsea, and hosted by me. Then, as now, will be a production of Escape Artists Inc. and released under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives license, and we leave you with this quote from director Ben Wheatley, whose movies In the Earth and A Field in England absolutely touch on ideas like the ones Liam explores so well here. If you judge everything by how photographically real it looks, then you're missing out on a lot of what art is about and what communication is. There are ambiguities in life, and that should be reflected in art, cinema, and storytelling, I think. I quite agree. Thanks for listening, folks. We always appreciate it. We'll see you next time.
It's a pseudopod. It's a big foot.
It's all about podcasts these days.